Silence fell over the Atlanta courtroom as little Kevin DeRuno stood before Judge Whitman. "Your Honor, I'd like to present evidence that will change everything," the 8-year-old said firmly. The judge's face twisted with disbelief. No one expected what happened next would rewrite justice forever. Before we dive into this incredible story, I'd love to know where you're watching from. Take a moment to hit that like button and subscribe to join our community of justice seekers. The courage this young boy showed will leave you speechless as we uncover how one child stood up against a corrupt system. Are you ready to witness how truth can prevail even through the smallest voice? The day that changed everything began like any other in the sun-drenched neighborhood of Oakwood Heights, a historically black community on Atlanta's east side. Parker Jackson, 67, a respected community elder with salt and pepper hair and gentle eyes that had witnessed the civil rights movement firsthand, was simply running an errand at Simmons' convenience store. The autumn air carried a slight chill as Parker, a former civil rights activist who'd once marched alongside Dr. King, spotted a distressed white woman struggling with her grocery bags in the parking lot. "Let me help you with that, ma'am," he offered with the same kindness he showed to everyone, regardless of color. Parker had barely gathered the scattered items when police cruisers screeched into the lot, responding to a robbery call placed minutes earlier. What happened next unfolded with the cruel efficiency of a system designed to presume guilt based on skin color. The white store owner, Ronald Simmons, a man who'd taken over his father's business and inherited his prejudices as well, immediately pointed at Parker. "That's him. That's the one who robbed me," he shouted, despite security footage clearly showing the actual perpetrator was a man at least 30 years younger. Officer Brennan and his partner wasted no time roughly spinning Parker around and slamming handcuffs on his wrists despite his protests about a recent shoulder surgery. "Please, officer, you're hurting me." Parker winced as the metal dug into his skin. "I'm just helping this lady. I didn't do anything." The officers ignored his pleas, tightening the cuffs further when he mentioned his medical condition. Several neighborhood residents, mostly black, gathered quickly and tried to explain that Parker was a pillar of the community, but Officer Brennan dismissed them with a wave of his hand. "Clear the area unless you want to join him," he barked. Across the street, watching the entire scene unfold with wide, terrified eyes, was Parker's grandson, Kevin DeRuno. The boy had been waiting for his grandfather to pick him up from the public library where he'd spent the afternoon reading, as he often did. Kevin's small hands trembled as he witnessed the man who had raised him since his parents' fatal car accident. 3 years ago, being treated like a criminal. At 8 years old, Kevin understood all too well what was happening. Parker had prepared him for this reality, though they'd both hoped he wouldn't face it so young. With Parker's arrest, Kevin's world collapsed. His grandfather was his sole guardian, his anchor, his everything, since losing his parents. Their modest 2-bedroom home was filled with books. Parker had always emphasized education as the path forward, continuing the legacy of Kevin's parents, both dedicated educators. The days following the arrest were a blur of confusion and fear. The overworked public defender assigned to Parker's case, Mr. Wallace, a man who hadn't won a case in years, barely glanced at the file before suggesting a plea deal. "Look, Mr. Jackson, they're offering 5 years instead of 15 if you plead guilty. With your age and health, that's the best deal you're going to get." He delivered this assessment while checking his watch, clearly eager to move on to the next of his 80 active cases. "But I'm innocent," Parker insisted, his voice steady despite the fear gripping his heart. "The security footage will show that." Mr. Wallace sighed, running a hand through his thinning hair. "The footage has been deemed inconclusive by the prosecution. Look, I've seen this play out 100 times. The system isn't designed for people like you to win." Parker understood exactly what the lawyer meant by people like you. The Oakwood Heights community rallied around Parker and Kevin. Neighbors brought food, offered temporary guardianship for Kevin, and pulled money for bail. But the judge had set it unusually high for a first-time alleged offender. Something about this case felt different, more targeted, but no one could quite put their finger on why. As weeks passed, with Parker still behind bars awaiting trial, Kevin spent hours in his grandfather's modest study, pulling leather-bound law books from the shelves. These weren't just any books. They were Parker's prized possessions from the dream he'd been forced to abandon decades ago when segregation made law school an impossible goal for a black man from his background. As Kevin flipped through the pages of complex legal texts, something awakened in him, a determination that burned brighter than his fear. With wisdom beyond his years, he understood that the public defender wouldn't save his grandfather. The judicial system seemed determined to railroad Parker, an innocent man whose only crime was being black in the wrong place at the wrong time. Clutching his grandfather's worn copy of constitutional law and civil liberties, Kevin made a solemn vow. "I'm going to bring you home, Grandpa. I promise." Kevin DeRuno had always been different from other children, his mind operating at a level that both amazed and sometimes frightened those around him. His earliest memories were of sitting on his mother's lap as she pointed to words in the newspaper. When he was just 3 years old, his tiny finger tracing the letters as he read aloud, shocking his parents with his natural ability. By 4, he was devouring chapter books meant for middle schoolers, his appetite for knowledge insatiable. His father, Dr. James Jackson, a professor of African American Studies, and his mother, Dr. Amara Jackson, a mathematics educator, had recognized their son's extraordinary gifts early on. In their modest home filled with books from floor to ceiling, they nurtured his intellect while also preparing him for the harsh realities awaiting a brilliant black child in America. "Your mind is a gift from God," his mother would tell him, brushing his kinky hair back from his forehead. "But there will be people who feel threatened by it. Sometimes, baby, you'll need to keep your light dimmed in certain company," his father would add with eyes that had seen too much disappointment. "They'll try to put you in a box, son. They'll try to tell you what a little black boy should and shouldn't know." These warnings confused young Kevin at first, but as he grew older and encountered the first whispers of prejudice at school, he began to understand the weight of his parents' words. When the drunk driver took both his parents on that rainy April night 30 years ago, 7-year-old Kevin's world shattered. The funeral remained a blur in his memory. Black suits, hushed voices, and the crushing weight of his grandfather's hand on his small shoulder. Both of them drowning in grief, too vast to comprehend. Parker Jackson stepped in as Kevin's guardian without hesitation, moving from his small apartment into the family home to maintain some semblance of stability for his grandson. Though bent with age and his own grief, Parker continued the educational legacy his son and daughter-in-law had begun. He shared stories of his youth during the civil rights movement, of the indignities he'd suffered, and of dreams deferred. "I wanted to be a lawyer," he confided one evening as they sorted through his old books together. "Had the brains for it. Got accepted to Howard Law in '68. His voice trailed off, remembering. "Why didn't you go, Grandpa?" Kevin asked, running his fingers along the spine of a constitutional law textbook. Parker's smile held decades of resignation. "Money dried up when my daddy got blacklisted for registering voters. Then my mama got sick. Some dreams just have to wait, and sometimes they wait too long." From that day forward, Kevin devoured his grandfather's legal collection, finding comfort in the precise language of the law, the clarity of its structures, the way it promised justice, even if it didn't always deliver it. These books became his refuge after the tragedy, his connection to the parents he'd lost, and the grandfather who sacrificed his dreams. At school, Kevin's abilities continued to astonish his teachers, though not always to his benefit. Miss Rodriguez, his third-grade teacher at Oakwood Elementary, recognized his potential immediately. "He doesn't belong in regular classes," she insisted to Principal Winters after Kevin corrected the history textbook's sanitized version of the civil rights movement. "He needs advanced placement, accelerated learning. I've never seen a mind like his." But Principal Winters, a man who prided himself on running a traditional school, dismissed her concerns. "We don't have the resources for special accommodations, and there's no evidence that these so-called gifted programs actually benefit African American students in the long run. Best not to set the boy up for disappointment." The thinly veiled prejudice behind his words wasn't lost on Miss Rodriguez, who continued to bring Kevin advanced materials, secretly creating an unofficial enrichment program during lunch periods. When Parker was arrested, Kevin's academic performance didn't falter. It intensified with a focus that unnerved even Ms. Rodriguez. He began specifically studying criminal law, evidence procedures, and precedents related to cases like his grandfather's. Living temporarily with their elderly neighbor, Mrs. Washington, Kevin would stay up late into the night, filling notebooks with detailed analyses of similar cases, creating timelines and documenting inconsistencies in the police report he'd managed to glimpse during a visit to Mr. Wallace's cluttered office. Kevin mapped out the exact timeline of the robbery using the store's location and his grandfather's documented movements. He could prove it was physically impossible for Parker to have committed the crime if only someone would listen. When he tried to share his findings with Mr. Wallace, the attorney patted his head distractedly. "That's nice, son. Very creative. Now let the grown-ups handle this." "Okay." Parker, despite his dire situation, initially resisted Kevin's involvement. During their brief weekly visits in the sterile visitation room, he would gently discourage his grandson's legal research. "This isn't your burden to bear, Kevin. You're just a child. You need to focus on school, on being a boy." But Kevin could see the fear behind his grandfather's eyes, could hear the tremble in his voice when he spoke of the other inmates, the E-God's casual cruelty, the way his health was deteriorating in the harsh prison environment. "I'm not just a child," Grandpa Kevin responded with quiet determination. "I'm your grandson, and I'm not going to let them take you away from me." A breakthrough came when Mrs. Washington, seeing Kevin's distress, connected him with her cousin's husband, retired Judge Harold Thompson, one of the first black judges in the state of Georgia. The elderly judge, initially humoring what he assumed was a child's naive project, was stunned by Kevin's legal acumen. "You found something here, young man." He admitted reviewing Kevin's meticulous notes on witness statement inconsistencies. "The question is, how do we get someone to listen?" Judge Thompson began offering subtle guidance, careful not to give the boy false hope, but unwilling to extinguish the brilliant flame of intelligence and determination he recognized in Kevin's eyes. "The law is a sword and a shield," he told the boy during their clandestine meetings in Mrs. Washington's kitchen. "It can cut down the innocent if wielded by the wrong hands, but it can also protect those who truly understand its power." With the preliminary hearing approaching, Kevin prepared with the intensity of a seasoned attorney, absorbing every legal nuance, memorizing relevant cases, and preparing for what he knew would be the fight of his young life, a fight for his grandfather's freedom and for the justice that had eluded so many who looked like them. The Atlanta County Courthouse loomed like a fortress of stone and prejudice, its imposing columns and marble steps designed to intimidate those seeking justice within its hallowed halls. Parker Jackson, wearing an ill-fitting suit borrowed from a church donation box, shuffled into courtroom 3B with shackled ankles and wrists. The orange jumpsuit replaced by civilian clothes that couldn't disguise the toll 2 months in county lockup had taken on his aging frame. The preliminary hearing was supposed to be a formality, a brief proceeding to establish whether enough evidence existed to move forward with a trial. But District Attorney Victoria Reynolds had other plans. An ambitious prosecutor with political aspirations and a perfect conviction record against black defendants, Reynolds swept into the courtroom in a tailored navy suit, her blonde hair pulled into a severe bun that matched her expression. At the defense table sat a disheveled Mr. Wallace, fumbling through papers he clearly hadn't reviewed until that morning. Kevin, small for his age and nearly swallowed by the hard wooden spectator bench, sat beside Mrs. Washington in the front row, his back straight, his eyes missing nothing. Judge Calvin Whitman entered, his robes flowing behind him like dark wings. Known throughout the county for his harsh sentencing of minorities and leniency toward white defendants, Whitman's presence sent a ripple of tension through the black community members who had come to support Parker. The hearing began with Reynolds presenting what she called overwhelming evidence of Parker's guilt. She displayed grainy security footage that showed only a tall black man in the store, his face never clearly visible. The defendant matches the height and build of the perpetrator, she claimed, glossing over the 30-year age difference. And we have the positive identification from the store owner, a respected businessman with no reason to lie. When she introduced a partial fingerprint allegedly belonging to Parker found on the counter, Mr. Wallace didn't even look up from his phone. Kevin frantically wrote a note and passed it to Mrs. Washington, who attempted to get it to the defense table, but the bailiff intercepted it. Reynolds continued introducing a criminal history that consisted solely of Parker's arrest during a peaceful civil rights protest in 1968, attempting to paint him as having a lifetime of anti-establishment tendencies. When she moved to enter a statement allegedly made by Parker that sounded suspiciously like a confession, Mr. Wallace finally stirred. Objection, Your Honor. Foundation." It was a half-hearted attempt at best showing his unfamiliarity with the case file. Judge Whitman peered over his glasses. "On what grounds, Counselor?" Mr. Wallace fumbled. "Well, I'm not sure my client ever made such a statement. The judge frowned. That's not a valid objection. Overruled. Tree. From the gallery, a small but clear voice rang out. Objection hearsay and violates the confrontation. Clause of the Sixth Amendment. All heads turned toward Kevin, who had risen to his feet, clutching a dogged copy of the Federal Rules of Evidence. The courtroom froze in collective shock. Judge Whitman's face darkened with anger. Who is that child? Belife, remove him immediately. As the bailiff moved toward Kevin, the boy continued, his voice steady despite his pounding heart. Your Honor, the prosecution is attempting to introduce an out-of court statement allegedly made by the defendant without establishing the circumstances under which it was obtained under Crawford versus Washington. This violates my grandfather's constitutional right to confront witnesses against him. Furthermore, there's no evidence this statement was ever made, as it appears nowhere in the police report filed on the day of arrest. The silence that followed was absolute. DeReynolds recovered first, her laugh cutting through the tension. Your Honor, this is absurd. We cannot have children disrupting court proceedings with legal jargon. They've clearly been coached. To recite, Judge Whitman seemed less certain, studying Kevin with narrowed eyes. A young man approached the bench. Mrs. Washington clutched Kevin's arm, but he gently removed her hand and walked forward with the dignity of someone 3 times his age. Standing before the bench, Kevin looked directly into Judge Whitman's cold eyes. What's your name, boy? The judge demanded. Kevin DeRuno, Your Honor. I'm Parker Jackson's grandson. And who has been feeding you legal terminology to disrupt my courtroom? Kevin squared his small shoulders. No one, Your Honor. I've been reading my grandfather's law book since I was 5. The statement Miss Reynolds is trying to introduce isn't just hearsay. It's a violation of Miranda versus Arizona if my grandfather wasn't properly advised of his rights before questioning. The police report shows no Miranda warning was given at the time of arrest. Judge Whitman glanced at D.A. Reynolds, who had lost some of her composure. The judge cleared his throat. Mr. Wallace, were you aware of this issue with the statement? The public defender, now fully alert and looking both impressed and embarrassed, stood. I was just getting to that, Your Honor. The judge sighed heavily. The objection is sustained. The alleged statement is inadmissible. He fixed Kevin with a stern gaze. Young man, while your knowledge is unexpected, any further outbursts will result in your removal from this courtroom. Is that clear? Kevin nodded respectfully. Yes, Your Honor. Thank you, Your Honor. As Kevin returned to his seat, whispers rippled through the gallery. Judge Whitman called a 15-minute recess, during which D.A. Reynolds could be seen making angry phone calls in the hallway. When court resumed, Reynolds proceeded more cautiously, but the damage to her case was evident. The judge set a trial date for 6 weeks later, and while he denied bail reduction, something had shifted in the atmosphere of the case. Local reporter Shanice Williams approached Kevin as they left the courthouse. That was incredible, she said, kneeling to his level. Would you mind telling me how you knew all that? Before Kevin could answer, Mrs. Washington intervened. No comments from the minor, please. But it was too late. By evening, local news had picked up the story of the 8-year-old legal prodigy defending his grandfather. As Mrs. Washington drove Kevin home, the boy stared out the window, his momentary triumph overshadowed by worry. They're going to come after me now, aren't they? He asked quietly. Mrs. Washington couldn't lie to him. Probably, child, but remember what your grandpa always says. Kevin nodded, reciting his grandfather's favorite phrase, the truth doesn't fear investigation. But as darkness fell over Atlanta, powerful people were already making calls determined to ensure that some truths remained buried regardless of who stood in their way, even if that someone was just 8 years old. Do you think our justice system treats everyone equally regardless of their race or background? Comment number 1 if you believe the system needs major reform, or number 2 if you think isolated incidents don't reflect the whole system. Be sure to like and subscribe to follow Kevin's incredible journey standing up against corruption. What lengths do you think the prosecutor and judge will go to in order to silence this brilliant young boy? And how will Kevin navigate the dangerous waters of a system designed to protect its own interests? Let's find out as the system begins to fight back against this unexpected threat. The morning after Kevin's courtroom intervention, the machinery of injustice began grinding into motion with terrifying efficiency. DA Victoria Reynolds sat in her corner office overlooking downtown Atlanta, the morning sun glinting off her. Numerous legal awards as she barked orders into her phone. I don't care what you have to do. That security footage needs to be enhanced to clearly show Jackson's face, or it needs to disappear entirely. This case just became high profile, and I won't be embarrassed by some precocious brat. Within hours, the original security tape from Simmons' convenience store was logged in evidence as damaged beyond recovery and replaced with a digital copy that conveniently showed only the portions that didn't exonerate Parker. The fingerprint evidence, initially described as partial and inconclusive in the forensic report, was suddenly upgraded to highly probable match without any new analysis. Detective James Mercer, who had built a career on questionable arrests in minority neighborhoods, personally visited 3 witnesses who had initially stated Parker was helping the white woman with her groceries. By afternoon, all 3 had mysteriously recalled new details that placed Parker inside the store during the robbery. The courthouse grapevine hummed with activity as judges, clerks, and bailiffs whispered about the child who had dared to challenge Judge Whitman's authority. Most dismissed it as a fluke, a child coached by some unseen legal advisor, but those who had witnessed Kevin's confident citation of case law weren't so sure. Judge Whitman himself placed a call to an old law school friend who now headed the Atlanta Child Protective Services Department. I'm concerned about a minor being exposed to inappropriate environments and potentially being exploited. He explained, his voice dripping with false concern. The boy's legal guardian is incarcerated, and whoever has temporary custody is clearly using this child as some sort of legal puppet. Someone should investigate the situation. In the dingy office assigned to public defenders, Mr. Wallace faced his own pressure. The head of the public defender's office called him in for a performance review, something that hadn't happened in the 15 years Wallace had worked there. "You've got the Jackson case right," his supervisor asked, leaning back in his creaking chair. "I'm hearing rumblings from upstairs. This one needs to go away quietly. Reynolds is offering manslaughter, 5 years with possibility of parole in 3. Take it." Wallace, shaken by his own inadequacy in court and newly impressed by Kevin's intervention, showed a rare moment of spine. The kid found legitimate issues with the evidence. There might be something to this innocence claim. His supervisor's expression hardened. "Wallace, you've got 83 active cases. You want to make it 90 by next week because that's what happens to people who don't play ball around here. Besides, think about the boy. What happens to him if his grandfather gets 20 years instead of 5? You want that on your conscience." The threat wasn't subtle, and Wallace's momentary courage wilted. Meanwhile, at Oakwood Elementary, Kevin found himself suddenly under scrutiny. Principal Winters called him to the office during lunch, where a woman in a severe suit introduced herself as Dr. Patterson from the school district's special evaluation team. "We've received some concerns about your academic placement," she explained with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "We'll be conducting a series of tests to determine if you might benefit from alternative educational settings." Kevin, wise beyond his years, recognized the threat. Alternative settings was often code for removing problem students from mainstream classes. "My test scores are in the 99th percentile," he replied calmly. "My teacher, Miss Rodriguez, can provide all my academic records." Dr. Patterson's smile tightened. "This isn't just about academics, Kevin. There are concerns about your emotional development, especially given your unique home situation." The implication was clear. His grandfather's incarceration was being weaponized against him. As Kevin left the office, he overheard Principal Winters on the phone. "Yes, sir, we're addressing the situation as requested." The words sent a chill down his spine. In the school hallway, the whispers and stares followed Kevin like shadows. His appearance on the local news had transformed him overnight, from the quiet, book-loving kid to an object of fascination and, in some cases, derision. "My dad says your grandpa is a criminal," taunted Tyler Johnson, whose father was a police officer. "He says the apple doesn't fall far from the tree." The words stung, but Kevin had developed a thick skin long before this crisis. What troubled him more was the reaction from adults he'd trusted. Miss Rodriguez, normally his strongest advocate, avoided eye contact in class, and when he approached her with questions about his advanced reading project, she nervously suggested he stick to the standard curriculum for now. The subtle withdrawal of support from the community wasn't limited to the school. At New Hope Baptist Church, where Parker had served as a deacon for 20 years, Pastor Williams called an emergency board meeting. "We all know Brother Parker is innocent," he began, "but this situation is drawing unwanted attention. The church's youth outreach grant is up for renewal with the city next month." The message was clear. Public support for Parker might jeopardize funding that served hundreds of children. One by one, community pillars who had initially spoken out began to step back, fearful of retaliation from a system they knew all too well could crush them. Mrs. Washington, however, remained steadfast. "Let them come for me," she declared when Kevin expressed concern for her safety. "I've lived 82 years in this world, seen the worst of what it can do, and I'm still here. They don't scare me." Her courage bolstered Kevin, but the most devastating blow came during his weekly visit with his grandfather. Parker looked diminished, his shoulders hunched, dark circles under his eyes suggesting sleepless nights. "Mr. Wallace came to see me," he said quietly when they were seated in the visitation room. "He says they're offering a deal. 5 years instead of potentially 20. Kevin's heart pounded. "Grandpa, you can't take it. You're innocent. We can prove it." Parker reached across the table to take his grandson's small hands. "Kevin, they're threatening to place you in foster care. Mrs. Washington is too old to fight a custody battle, and they know it. If I take this deal, they'll guarantee you can stay with her until I get out." Tears welled in Kevin's eyes. "They can't do that. There are laws." Parker's smile was sad. "Son, you're learning the hardest lesson about the law. It's supposed to protect everyone equally, but the people who enforce it have their own ideas about who deserves that protection." That night, unable to sleep, Kevin pored over legal texts until his eyes burned. In a dusty volume on family law, he discovered a legal maneuver so audacious it might just work if he had the courage to attempt it. The next morning, he called Judge Thompson from Mrs. Washington's landline. "I need your help, sir," he said when the retired judge answered. "I found something that might save my grandfather, but I can't do it alone." Judge Thompson listened carefully to Kevin's plan, silent for a long moment after the boy finished speaking. "That's never been done by someone your age," he finally said. "The legal precedent is thin at best, but it exists," Kevin pressed. "And the law doesn't specify a minimum age requirement." Another long pause. "You understand what you're risking? They'll come at you with everything they have." Kevin thought of his grandfather's defeated posture, of the system grinding him down, of the deal that would steal 5 years of his innocent life. "They're already doing that, sir. At least this way, we fight back on our terms." 2 days later, as Child Protective Services workers arrived at Mrs. Washington's home with papers to evaluate Kevin's living situation, they were met by a court courier delivering a document of a very different kind, one that would send shockwaves through the Atlanta legal establishment and force Judge Whitman's court to confront something they'd never encountered before. A motion filed by an 8-year-old boy that might just change everything. The clerk at the Atlanta County Courthouse stared in disbelief at the meticulously prepared legal document before her, then at the small boy standing on tiptoes to see over the counter. "You're filing this?" she asked, adjusting her glasses as if they might be malfunctioning. Kevin nodded solemnly. "Yes, ma'am. It's a motion to serve as legal advisor to the defendant pursuant to Georgia Code Section 15928 and the precedent established in Wilkins versus Georgia." The clear blinked rapidly, clearly torn between procedure and the absurdity of the situation. "But how old are you, honey?" 8 years and 7 months, Kevin replied. "The statute doesn't specify an age requirement for advisors to precede defendants, only that they have sufficient knowledge to assist the court in pursuing justice." Behind Kevin stood Judge Thompson, presenting himself merely as a family friend, rather than the legal mind who had helped refine the audacious motion. "The filing fee has been paid," he noted quietly, sliding the receipt across the counter. "The young man is simply exercising his grandfather's right to assistance." With reluctant movements, the clerk stamped the document, officially entering into the court record the most unusual motion Judge Whitman's court had ever received. A petition from an 8-year-old to serve as legal advisor to his grandfather, who would exercise his right to self-representation rather than rely on the ineffective assistance of his public defender. News of the filing spread through the courthouse like wildfire, reaching Judge Whitman's chambers within the hour. The judge, in the middle of his morning coffee, nearly choked when his clerk informed him of the development. "This is preposterous," he sputtered, face weening. "Deny it immediately." His clerk shifted uncomfortably. "Sir, according to procedure, this type of motion requires a hearing. Denying it outright could create grounds for appeal." Whitman slammed his coffee mug down, sloshing the dark liquid onto case files. "Fine, schedule a hearing for next month. This ridiculous stunt needs to die quickly, but we'll follow procedure to the letter." The clear hesitated again. The motion cites the defendant's Sixth Amendment right to a speedy trial, requesting an expedited hearing within 72 hours. The vein in Whitman's temple throbbed visibly. "Tomorrow 9:00 a.m. Let's get this circus over with." By afternoon, Kevin's motion had leaked to local media. Shanice Williams, the reporter who had first noticed Kevin at the preliminary hearing, broke the story on the 6 Sizzurun News. In an unprecedented legal move, 8-year-old Kevin DeRuno has filed a motion to serve as legal advisor to his grandfather Parker Jackson, who maintains his innocence in the Simmons convenience store robbery case. Legal experts are divided on whether this unusual request has any chance of success. The story was picked up by national outlets by evening, with legal commentators weighing in on the extraordinary development. While there's no explicit age requirement for legal advisors to pros defendants, in Georgia, explained one expert on a cable news panel, the court must determine if the advisor has sufficient understanding of the law to be helpful rather than harmful to the defendant's case. This will likely come down to Judge Whitman's discretion. That discretion, as anyone familiar with Whitman's record knew, was unlikely to favor the Jacksons. DA Reynolds wasted no time in filing an opposition to the motion, citing judicial efficiency and the best interests of the minor child as reasons to reject what she termed a publicity stunt designed to garner sympathy for the defendant. Behind the scenes, she worked the phones furiously, calling in favors from the Georgia Bar Association to the Department of Family Services, determined to crush this challenge to her authority. Yet, as outlandish as Kevin's motion seemed, it had created a procedural hurdle that even Reynolds and Whitman couldn't simply ignore. The hearing would have to proceed, and Kevin would have his moment to demonstrate his legal knowledge before the court. What no one anticipated was the appearance of Catherine Sullivan outside Mrs. Washington's modest home the evening before the hearing. A partner at Maxwell and Brick, one of Atlanta's most prestigious law firms, Sullivan was known for taking on civil rights cases pro bono, despite her firm's corporate focus. "I'd like to speak with Kevin DeRuno," she told Mrs. Washington, who eyed the white woman suspiciously. "I think I might be able to help." Kevin, hearing the conversation from the living room where he was preparing his arguments, came to the door. "Are you here because of my motion, Miss Sullivan?" The attorney nodded, impressed by the boy's directness. "I am. What you're attempting is remarkable, but you're up against powerful opposition. I'd like to offer my services to represent your grandfather with you as a consultant." Mrs. Washington's eyes narrowed. Why would a big-shot lawyer from downtown suddenly take interest in our case? Sullivan's expression softened. "Because 20 years ago, my brother was wrongfully convicted of a crime he didn't commit. He spent 12 years in prison before DNA evidence exonerated him. Some cases choose you." After Sullivan left, having been granted permission to represent Parker with Kevin as a consultant, the boy's motion now transformed into a request to serve as a consultant to Sullivan's defense team. Mrs. Washington made a phone call to Judge Thompson. "Can we trust her?" she asked bluntly. The retired judge was thoughtful. "Catherine Sullivan has a reputation for integrity. Her firm won't like this. They represent some powerful interests in this city. But if anyone has the skill and the backbone to stand up to Whitman and Reynolds, it's her." The next morning, the courtroom was packed beyond capacity. Reporters filled the back rows, sketch artists poised with pencils since cameras weren't allowed. Judge Whitman entered with a scowl that deepened when he saw Catherine Sullivan at the defense table. Kevin, seated beside her in a carefully pressed suit that had belonged to him at Kevin's age, hastily altered by Mrs. Washington to fit the boy's small frame. "So, Your Honor," Sullivan began before Whitman could speak, "I filed an appearance as counsel for Mr. Jackson with a modified motion requesting that Kevin DeRuno be permitted to serve as a consultant to the defense team pursuant to the defendant's Sixth Amendment rights." Judge Whitman's fingers drummed impatiently on the bench. "Miss Sullivan, while I'm surprised by your involvement in this case, the court still needs to determine if this child has any business in these proceedings at all. This strikes me as a transparent attempt to manipulate the court's sympathies." Sullivan remained unruffled. Then perhaps a demonstration of Kevin's legal knowledge would address the court's concerns. The judge leaned forward. Indeed, let's put this charade to rest. What followed was unlike anything the Atlanta County Courthouse had ever witnessed. For 45 minutes, Judge Whitman peppered Kevin with increasingly complex legal questions, clearly expecting the boy to falter. Explain the rule against perpetuities, he demanded at one point, referencing an obscure property law concept that confounded many law students. Without hesitation, Kevin recited, "The rule against perpetuity states that no interest in property is valid unless it vests, if at all, not later than 21 years after some life in being at the creation of the interest. It's primarily a rule against remoteness of vesting, as established in the Duke of Norfolk's case in 1682 and codified in Georgia under Code Section 44-6201. A murmur ran through the courtroom. Judge Whitman's eyes narrowed. And how would the exclusionary rule apply to evidence in your grandfather's case? The exclusionary rule would prevent the prosecution from introducing evidence obtained through an illegal search or seizure, Kevin explained. In my grandfather's case, the officers conducted a Padtown search without reasonable suspicion that he was armed and dangerous, violating Terry versus Ohio. Any evidence from that illegal search should be suppressed under MAP versus Ohio, which incorporated the Fourth Amendment exclusionary rule to the states through the 14th Amendment. As the questioning continued, even D.A. Reynolds shifted uncomfortably in her seat. Judge Whitman's face grew increasingly flushed as Kevin handled each question with the precision of a seasoned attorney. Finally, after Kevin correctly explained the complex hearsay exceptions under Federal Rule of Evidence 803, including the subtle distinctions between excited utterances and present-sense impressions, the judge abruptly ended the examination. The court will take a 15-minute recess, he announced, rising quickly and retreating to his chambers. During the break, the courtroom buzzed with conversation. Legal interns frantically Googled Kevin's answers, confirming their accuracy. Reporters scribbled notes, already crafting headlines about the legal prodigy. D.A. Reynolds huddled with her, assistants, their expressions grim. When court resumed, Judge Whitman's demeanor had shifted subtly. While this situation is highly unusual, he began, his tone measured. The court cannot ignore the defendant's right to assistance of his choosing, provided that assistance is competent. Against all reasonable expectation, Kevin DeRuno has demonstrated a level of legal understanding that satisfies the court's concerns about competency. A collective gasp went through the gallery. The judge continued quickly. However, to maintain proper decorum and procedure, the court will impose strict limitations. Kevin DeRuno may consult with Mrs. Sullivan and his grandfather, but may not directly address the court or witnesses during trial. Mrs. Sullivan will serve as counsel of record and handle all courtroom proceedings. It was a significant concession wrapped in restrictions, exactly what Sullivan had hoped for. D.A. Reynolds immediately rose to object, but Judge Whitman cut her off. The court has ruled, Miss Reynolds, prepare your case for trial 3 weeks from today. As the courtroom cleared, Reynolds cornered Sullivan in the hallway, her voice low and threatening. You've made a serious mistake taking this case, Catherine. Your firm represents half the power players in this city. How do you think they'll react to you defending a criminal against me? Sullivan smiled thinly. That's between me and my partners, Victoria. But if Parker Jackson is the dangerous criminal you claim, why are you so worried about an 8-year-old consultant and a corporate attorney defending him? Reynolds stepped closer. This isn't about Jackson. This is bigger than you know. Walk away while you still can. Back at Mrs. Washington's house, the celebration was tempered by the knowledge that the real battle was just beginning. Catherine's phone rang repeatedly with calls from her senior partners, which she pointedly ignored. They'll demand I withdraw from the case, she explained to Kevin and Mrs. Washington. We need to prepare everything quickly before they can force me out. Kevin nodded solemnly. We should start by re-examining the witnesses, the 3 people who changed their stories. I think they were pressured. Sullivan looked at him with newfound respect. Exactly what I was thinking. We'll also need to locate the original security footage before it was conveniently damaged. As they began mapping out their strategy, Kevin felt a flicker of hope for the first time since his grandfather's arrest. They had won the first skirmish, but the war was just beginning, and their opponents were growing more dangerous by the day. The system that had expected to crush them with impunity had received its first shock, and like any wounded predator, it would strike back with even greater ferocity. The morning of the trial arrived with an unseasonable chill. Dark clouds hanging low over the Atlanta skyline, as if the very heavens sensed the gravity of what was about to unfold in courtroom 3B. Parker Jackson, thinner after months in county jail, but standing straighter with renewed hope, entered, wearing a dignified charcoal suit borrowed from Judge Thompson's closet. At the defense table, Catherine Sullivan organized her notes with military precision, while Kevin arranged color-coded folders containing their painstaking research. During the 3 weeks since the hearing, they had worked tirelessly, often until midnight, building their case piece by piece. Their preparation had not gone uncontested. True to Catherine's prediction, her law firm had issued an ultimatum: withdraw from the Jackson case or clean out her office. When she chose the latter without hesitation, they froze her accounts and threatened to contact every client she might approach as an independent attorney. Judge Thompson quietly reached out to former colleagues, securing emergency funding to ensure Catherine could continue. Meanwhile, the jury selection process revealed the depth of bias they were facing. D.A. Reynolds systematically eliminated virtually every black potential juror through peremptory challenges, offering paper-thin justifications when Sullivan raised bats and objections. "Your Honor," Sullivan argued after the fifth black juror was struck, "the prosecution has now used 5 peremptory challenges against African-American candidates, suggesting a clear pattern of racial discrimination in jury selection." Judge Whitman sighed with theatrical weariness. "Miss Sullivan, Miss Reynolds has provided race-neutral explanations for each strike. The court finds no Batson violation." Kevin slid a note to Catherine. "Document everything for appeal. Also, Juror 12, third row." She didn't disclose. Her brother works for the DA's office. Sullivan's eyebrows raised slightly as she scribbled a response. "How do you know that?" Kevin's reply was simple. "Her Facebook profile is public. She posted about his promotion last month." This pattern continued throughout jury selection, Kevin's remarkable attention to detail providing insights that even veteran attorneys might miss. By afternoon, they faced an almost entirely white jury with just one elderly black woman who had likely survived cuts because she'd mentioned attending the same church as Judge Whitman's mother. The trial opened with Reynolds' theatrical flair on full display. She strode before the jury box, her voice resonating with practiced indignation. "Ladies and gentlemen, this case is about a community terrorized, a business owner, robbed at gunpoint, and a defendant who thought he was above the law." She painted Parker as a calculating criminal with a hidden past, strategically referencing his civil rights arrests as evidence of anti-authority tendencies, while carefully avoiding language that would trigger a mistrial. Throughout her 40-and-out opening, Judge Whitman nodded approvingly, interrupting only when Sullivan objected to particularly egregious characterizations. When Catherine rose for the defense opening, the contrast was striking. Rather than matching Reynolds' theatrics, she spoke quietly, forcing jurors to lean forward to hear her. "This case isn't about a robbery," she began. "It's about a rush to judgment, about assumptions made because of the color of a man's skin, and about evidence manipulated to fit a predetermined conclusion." She methodically humanized Parker, describing his decades of community service, his raising of Kevin after the tragic death of the boy's parents, his volunteer work with homeless veterans. Judge Whitman interrupted her repeatedly. "Miss Sullivan, please confine your statements to relevant facts of the case." "Your Honor," she responded evenly. "The prosecution spent 20 minutes discussing Mr. Jackson's character. I'm simply providing the jury with a complete picture." The judge scowled but allowed her to continue, though his interruptions created a disjointed narrative that clearly frustrated the defense. The prosecution's case began with Ronald Simmons, the convenience store owner, taking the stand with practiced indignation. He described a tall black man entering his store, threatening him with a gun, and stealing $400 from the register. "And is the man who robbed you in this courtroom today?" Reynolds asked. Simmons pointed dramatically at Parker. "That's him right there. I'll never forget his face." Catherine's cross-examination started gently. "Mr. Simmons, you've identified Mr. Jackson as the robber. How long was the perpetrator in your store?" "About 5 minutes," Simmons replied confidently. "And you got a clear look at his face?" "Absolutely," Sullivan nodded thoughtfully. "Mr. Simmons, I'm going to show you what's been marked as Defense Exhibit A." She displayed a still image from the security footage. This shows the perpetrator wearing a baseball cap pulled low in a high-neck jacket. Could you please point to where we can see his face clearly? Simmons shifted uncomfortably. Well, I saw it clearer in person. I understand. Now, in your statement to police on the day of the incident, you described the robber as around 30 years old. Is that correct? I might have said that. Yes. Mr. Jackson is 67. That's quite a discrepancy, isn't it? Before Simmons could answer, Reynolds objected. Argumentative, Your Honor. Judge Whitman nodded. Sustained. Kevin passed Catherine a note and she adjusted course. Mr. Simmons, prior to the lineup where you identified Mr. Jackson, did any police officers show you his photograph or suggest he was their suspect? Simmons hesitated just long enough. Not that I recall Sullivan presented. The police report. According to Detective Mercer's notes, he showed you a single photograph of Mr. Jackson before the lineup and told you they had caught the guy. Isn't that true? Reynolds was on her feet instantly. Objection. Counsel is mischaracterizing the evidence. As the judge sustained the objection, Kevin slid another note to Catherine, who nodded subtly. Mr. Simmons, isn't it true that your store was facing foreclosure at the time of the robbery? The question landed like a thunderbolt. Reynolds objected immediately, but Kevin had anticipated this, preparing a legal argument that Sullivan now delivered. Your Honor, the witness's financial situation is directly relevant to his credibility and potential motivation to fabricate a robbery for insurance purposes. Judge Whitman reluctantly overruled Reynolds' objection, and Simmons was forced to admit his business had been failing for months before the incident. By the time Sullivan finished her cross-examination, Simmons's identification appeared far less credible, though the damage wasn't as devastating as they had hoped. The prosecution's parade of witnesses continued with Officer Brennan, who testified about arresting Parker at the scene. His account portrayed Parker as belligerent and uncooperative. Claims that Sullivan methodically dismantled by having him read his own contemporaneous notes describing the suspect as calm and confused. Detective Mercer took the stand next, presenting the enhanced security footage and fingerprint evidence with smooth confidence. When Sullivan began questioning the chain of custody for this evidence, Judge Whitman repeatedly sustained Reynolds' objections, preventing a full exploration of the suspicious timing of the enhancements. The day's most damaging testimony came from 3 neighborhood witnesses who had initially told police that Parker was helping a woman with groceries during the robbery. All 3 now claimed they had been confused about the timing and actually saw Parker running from the store minutes earlier. Kevin's expression remained neutral, but his small hand gripped his pencil so tightly it nearly snapped as he documented each contradiction between their current testimony and initial statements. As the first day of trial concluded, the prosecution's case appeared strong, despite the defense's efforts. In the courthouse hallway, reporters surrounded Catherine and Kevin. "Do you still believe you can win this case?" one shouted. Catherine placed a protective hand on Kevin's shoulder. "We believe in Mr. Jackson's innocence, and we believe in justice. That's all we have to say today." In the car ride back to Mrs. Washington's home, Kevin finally allowed his composure to crack. "They're lying," he said, his voice trembling with righteous anger. "All of them." Detective Mercer threatened those witnesses. "I can tell." Catherine nodded grimly. "I know, but proving it is another matter." She hesitated before continuing. "Kevin, there's something else you should know. I received a warning. This morning, Anonymous slipped under my door. It said to drop this case or face consequences beyond legal defeat." Mrs. Washington gasped, but Kevin's expression hardened with determination. "They're scared, Chamois," he said with wisdom beyond his years. "People only threaten when they're afraid of the truth." That night, while Catherine reviewed transcripts and prepared for the next day's witnesses, Kevin sat cross-legged on Mrs. Washington's living room floor, spreading out documents in a pattern only he understood. Around midnight, he suddenly sat up straight. "I see it now," he whispered. "The pattern. It's not just about Grandpa. It's about the whole neighborhood." When Catherine asked what he meant, the boy explained his theory, one so audacious yet logical that it might just explain why such extraordinary efforts were being made to convict an innocent man. As dawn broke over Atlanta, they prepared for day 2 with renewed purpose and a daring strategy that would either save Parker or destroy their last chance of justice. Have you ever witnessed someone being treated unfairly by authorities based solely on their appearance? Comment number 1 if you've seen racial profiling firsthand, or number 2 if you believe our justice system treats everyone equally. Don't forget to like and subscribe to follow this powerful story of courage and determination against overwhelming odds. What do you think Kevin has discovered about the real reason behind his grandfather's arrest? Could this 8-year-old boy's brilliant mind have uncovered a conspiracy bigger than anyone imagined? And with powerful forces aligned against them, will Catherine and Kevin be able to turn the tide in this seemingly impossible case? The courtroom showdown continues. As we move toward a turning point that no one saw coming, the second day of trial began with an ominous development that sent ripples of concern through the defense team. Catherine Sullivan, who had appeared perfectly healthy the previous evening, arrived at the courthouse deathly pale, barely able to stand without support. "Food poisoning," she whispered to Kevin as they took their seats at the defense table. Her normally immaculate appearance disheveled, her complexion ashen. "Started around 3 a.m. I think someone might have tampered with my takeout." Parker leaned forward, his face etched with concern. "Miss Sullivan, you need a hospital, not a courtroom." She shook her head weakly. "Can't request a continuance. Whitman will deny it. We can't lose momentum." When Judge Whitman entered and proceedings began, Catherine struggled to her feet, visibly swaying. "Your Honor, I regret to inform the court that I've fallen seriously ill overnight. I request a one-day continuance to seek medical treatment." Reynolds immediately objected. "Your Honor, this appears to be a delay tactic. The prosecution has important witnesses scheduled today who have taken time off work." Judge Whitman barely pretended to consider the request. "Miss Sullivan, while I sympathize with your condition, the court's schedule is extremely tight. The trial will proceed as planned. You may seek medical attention during our lunch recess." Catherine clutched the edge of the table, her knuckles white. "Your Honor, in that case, I request permission for co-counsel to take over temporarily while I, Whitman, cut her off." "You have no co-counsel on record, Miss Sullivan. You may proceed, or Mr. Jackson can represent himself today. Those are your options." The judge's smirk made clear which outcome he expected and preferred. The gallery murmured in disbelief at the callousness of the ruling. Kevin tugged gently at Catherine's sleeve, whispering urgently in her ear. She listened, eyebrows rising, then slowly nodded. "Your Honor," she said, straightening despite her obvious pain. "In that case, Mr. Jackson wishes to exercise his constitutional right to self-representation for today's proceedings, with Kevin DeRuno serving as his legal advisor under the court's previous ruling." Reynolds was on her feet instantly. "Your Honor, this is absurd. The minor was permitted to consult with counsel, not to directly advise a proc defendant." Judge Whitman leaned back, a smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "Actually, Ms. Reynolds, the court's order specified that Kevin DeRuno could serve as a consultant to the defense team. If Mr. Jackson is representing himself, he becomes the defense team." He turned to the jury with a patronizing expression. "This should be enlightening. The court will permit this arrangement for today only." His confidence was clear. He believed Parker and Kevin would doom their own case, making his eventual guilty verdict unassailable on appeal. A bailiff helped Catherine to a chair in the gallery, where she could observe while trying not to vomit. Parker, now seated alone at the defense table with Kevin beside him, looked terrified but resolute. The prosecution called Detective James Mercer back to the stand to continue his testimony from the previous day. As the detective settled in, smirking at the grandfather-grandson defense team, Reynolds began leading him through prepared questions about the fingerprint evidence. "Detective Mercer, could you explain to the jury how the fingerprint found at the scene conclusively matches the defendant?" Mercer launched into a technical explanation about ridge patterns and points of comparison, using jargon clearly intended to impress and confuse the jury. When Reynolds finished her direct examination, Judge Whitman turned to Parker. "Mr. Jackson, you may cross-examine the witness." Parker rose slowly, buttoning his suit jacket. "Your Honor, with the court's permission, I'd like to follow my grandson's advice on the questions." Whitman nodded condescendingly. "Pro se." What happened next stunned the courtroom into silence. Parker began asking questions that were clearly being whispered to him by Kevin. Questions so precisely crafted and technically sophisticated that Detective Mercer began to sweat visibly under the bright courtroom lights. "Detective Mercer." Parker began, his voice gaining strength with each word. "The fingerprint report initially classified the evidence as inconclusive, due to partial impression. Did it not? Mercer shifted in his seat. The preliminary report said that yes, but further analysis, please answer yes or no, detective. The initial report prepared by forensic technician Sandra Weiss on April 12th classified the fingerprint as inconclusive. Correct. Yes. But and this further analysis you mentioned was conducted by yourself, not by a certified fingerprint examiner. Correct, Reynolds objected. But to maintain the appearance of fairness before the increasingly attentive jury, Whitman overruled her. Mercer was forced to admit he had no formal certification in fingerprint analysis. Parker continued following Kevin's whispered guidance. Detective, could you please explain to the jury why the chain of custody documents show the original security footage was checked out by you on April 15th, but never checked back? In Merck's face reamed. There was a clerical error in the documentation. A clerical error, Parker repeated, and this error occurred right after my grandson questioned the footage's authenticity during the preliminary hearing. Correct? The objection, Reynolds shouted. Speculation and argumentative. Judge Whitman sustained the objection, but the damage was done. Jurors were exchanging glances, one even taking notes. Parker and Kevin methodically constructed a timeline showing physical impossibility. If the store's own timestamp security footage was accurate, Parker would have needed to be in two places simultaneously. When Mercer attempted to dismiss the timestamp as often unreliable, Kevin slid a document to Parker, who presented it to the witness. Detective, is this the maintenance record for Simmons's security system showing it was professionally calibrated just 2 days before the robbery? As the morning progressed, Kevin guided his grandfather through a cross-examination, so effective that Judge Whitman began sustaining objections that hadn't even been raised, desperately trying to interrupt the devastating rhythm of questions. The climax came when Parker, following Kevin's whispered instruction, asked about Mercer's disciplinary record. Detective, isn't it true that you've been the subject of 3 internal affairs investigations for misconduct in cases involving black suspects? Reynolds exploded from her chair. Objection, prejudicial and irrelevant. Before Whitman could rule, Parker quickly added, Your Honor, this goes directly to bias and credibility of the witness, which are always relevant in cross-examination. Kevin had prepared this argument precisely knowing the legal standard would make it difficult for Whitman to sustain the objection without creating clear grounds for appeal. The judge reluctantly overruled Reynolds, his face darkening as he realized the trap he'd fallen into. Mercer was forced to acknowledge the investigations, though he claimed all had cleared him of wrongdoing. Final question, Detective, Parker said, his voice now commanding the courtroom. In the past 5 years, how many cases have you investigated involving property crimes in the Oakwood Heights neighborhood? I don't keep track of statistics like that, Mercer replied evasively. Parker presented a document Kevin had obtained through a public records request. According to police department records, you've investigated 17 property crimes in Oakwood Heights in the past 5 years. In 15 of those cases, you arrested black residents. The neighborhood is 40% white, yet not a single white resident was arrested by you. Can you explain this discrepancy? Before Mercer could answer, he lost his composure entirely. Look, some neighborhoods need extra policing, and some people are more likely to be criminals. That's just reality, not racism. A gasp rippled through the courtroom. One female juror covered her mouth in shock, while another began writing furiously in her notebook. Even Judge Whitman appeared stunned by the detective's outburst. During the lunch recess, Catherine, who had been watching in amazement despite her illness, managed to whisper to Kevin, "That was masterful. Where did you learn to structure cross-examination like that?" The boy's response was simple. I read Clarence Darrow's biography 3 times, and I watched how prosecutors trapped innocent people on TV. The afternoon brought the prosecution's forensic analyst to the stand, but the momentum had shifted perceptibly. The jury now watched Kevin with undisguised fascination as he whispered instructions to his grandfather. Several jurors began nodding along with Parker's questions, while one elderly white man in the back row actually smiled encouragingly when Kevin passed a particularly insightful note. Outside the courthouse, media coverage exploded. Clips of the 8-year-old legal prodigy guiding his grandfather through expert cross-examination went viral with hashtags like Kevin Justice and Child Attorney trending nationally. Legal commentators expressed astonishment at the boy's understanding her evidence rules and trial strategy. "What we're witnessing is unprecedented," one former prosecutor told CNN. "This child has an intuitive grasp of cross-examination that many law school graduates lack." By day's end, the prosecution's case had been severely undermined. Reynolds appeared shaken as she requested an early adjournment, claiming she needed to reorganize her witness schedule. A transparent excuse to regroup after the day's devastating testimony. Judge Whitman, struggling to maintain control of his courtroom and his composure, granted the request. As they prepared to leave, Catherine, looking marginally better after medication from the court nurse, leaned down to Kevin's level. "You saved us today," she said softly, "but tomorrow will be harder. Reynolds will come back with everything she has." Kevin nodded solemnly. "I know, but now we have something too." "What's that?" Catherine asked. Kevin pointed discreetly toward the jury box where several jurors were watching them with expressions of open curiosity and growing sympathy. "Reasonable doubt," he whispered. That evening, as news vans parked along Mrs. Washington's quiet street, Kevin received an unexpected visitor. Judge Thompson arrived carrying a weathered leather briefcase. "I thought you could use these," he said, opening it to reveal dozens of carefully organized notes on Judge Whitman's previous cases, highlighting patterns of bias and procedural irregularities. "I've been documenting his misconduct for years, waiting for the right case to bring it to light." He placed a hand on Kevin's shoulder. "I believe this is that case." With these new resources and the day's momentum, they worked into the night preparing for what would surely be Reynolds' aggressive counterstrike. None of them could have predicted, however, just how desperate the prosecution would become, or how their actions would inadvertently provide the key to unlocking the entire conspiracy surrounding Parker's arrest. The third day of trial dawned with Catherine Sullivan back at the defense table, recovered enough to resume her role, though still pale and occasionally sipping ginger tea to settle her stomach. The courtroom was packed beyond capacity, with a line stretching down the hallway of people hoping to witness what had become Atlanta's most talked-about trial in decades. National news networks had dispatched correspondents, and even several celebrities had tweeted support for the brilliant legal child defending justice. Judge Whitman entered looking distinctly unsettled, his usual confident demeanor replaced by a tense alertness. D.A. Reynolds, by contrast, appeared unnervingly calm as she arranged her notes, which Kevin noted was more concerning than her previous day's frustration. "She's got something planned," he whispered to Catherine, "something she thinks will win the case." Their concerns were confirmed when Reynolds began by requesting a sidebar conference. For nearly 15 minutes, the attorneys and judge engaged in an intense, whispered conversation, while the courtroom waited in suspended animation. When they returned to their places, Whitman's expression was grim but triumphant. "The prosecution has brought a matter of potential misconduct to the court's attention," he announced. "It appears that unauthorized individuals may have been investigating aspects of this case outside proper channels." His eyes fixed accusingly on Kevin. "The court will consider appropriate sanctions after today's proceedings." Catherine looked shaken as she returned to the defense table. "They know about Judge Thompson's research," she murmured. "They're threatening to have him investigated for interfering with the case." Before Kevin could respond, Reynolds called her surprise witness, Lisa Martinez, a clerk from the records department. With practiced precision, Reynolds led the witness through testimony establishing that someone had accessed police records related to Oakwood Heights property crimes using Judge Thompson's old credentials. And accessing these records without current authorization is a violation of department policy. "Correct?" Reynolds asked. "Yes, a serious violation," Martinez confirmed. The implication was clear. The defense's devastating cross-examination of Detective Mercer had relied on improperly obtained information. Reynolds shot a triumphant look toward Kevin, clearly expecting the boy to be intimidated. Instead, Kevin calmly passed Catherine a note. After reading it, she stood for cross-examination with renewed confidence. "Ms. Martinez, when a retired judge requests public records through proper channels, what form is used?" The clerk appeared confused. "Form RA7, the standard public records request." Catherine produced a document like this one, submitted by Judge Thompson 3 weeks ago, requesting precisely the records in question as a private citizen under the Georgia Open Records Act. Martinez examined the form, her confidence visibly deflating. "Yes, this appears to be properly filed. And did your department fulfill this legal request?" Yes, according to our stamps, it was processed on May 3rd. So these records were legally obtained through proper channels, weren't they? Martinez had no choice but to agree. Reynolds' attempt to discredit their evidence had backfired spectacularly. As Reynolds called her next witness, Kevin tugged urgently at Catherine's sleeve, pointing to a man who had just entered the courtroom, a thin, nervous-looking individual clutching a manila envelope. Catherine nodded in recognition. This was Jacob Kleen, a former IT specialist for the city planning department, who had responded to their discreet inquiries about Oakwood Heights property records. His appearance was unexpected but potentially game-changing. While Reynolds questioned a forensic analyst about fingerprint evidence, Catherine quietly dispatched Mrs. Washington to speak with Kleen in the hallway. When she returned, she slipped. Catherine, a note. He has documents proving the convenience store robbery was staged to intimidate Parker and other homeowners. Development company connected to Reynolds' husband. Catherine's eyes widened slightly, but she maintained her poker face as she continued cross-examining the analyst, methodically undermining his credibility, while they waited for the right moment to introduce their bombshell. That moment came when Reynolds, growing increasingly desperate as her case crumbled, called Ronald Simmons back to the stand to clarify his earlier testimony. As Simmons took the oath again, Kevin noticed something odd. A subtle nod exchanged between the store owner and Judge Whitman, so quick it would be imperceptible to most observers. During Reynolds' questioning, Simmons suddenly introduced new remembered details about the robbery, including a claim that Parker had threatened him by name, implying a pre-existing relationship and motive. He said, "Simmons, this is what happens when you don't take the offer." The store owner testified a rehearsed quality to his words. "I think he was talking about when I refused to sell my store." When Catherine rose for cross-examination, her strategy had shifted completely based on Klein's information. "Mr. Simmons, you testified that my client referenced the offer for your store. Who exactly made this offer?" Reynolds objected immediately. "Irrelevant, Your Honor." Kevin had prepared for this, quickly writing a legal argument that Catherine delivered flawlessly. "Your Honor, the witness himself introduced this alleged statement about the offer as part of the robbery. The defense has the right to explore what this supposed statement meant, as it goes directly to the prosecution's theory of motive." Judge Whitman, trapped by his own evidentiary rules, reluctantly overruled the objection. Simmons shifted uncomfortably. "It was some development company, Peachtree Partners or something. Piedmont Properties Group," Catherine suggested. Simmons nodded. "Yeah, that's it. And when did they first approach you about selling your convenience store?" "About 6 months. Hi." Catherine produced a document. "Mr. Simmons, I'm showing you what's been marked as Defense Exhibit G, a property acquisition map from Piedmont Properties Group. Can you confirm that your store is marked in red on this map?" Simmons studied the document. "Yes, that's my place. And can you read what's written in the margin next to your property?" Reynolds jumped up. "Objection. This document hasn't been authenticated or properly introduced into evidence," sustained, Whitman said quickly. Catherine pivoted seamlessly. "Mr. Simmons, are you familiar with a man named Richard Bennett?" The store owner's face palled visibly. "He's one of the partners at Piedmont. And has Mr. Bennett ever discussed what would happen if property owners in Oakwood Heights refused to sell?" Objection. Reynolds shouted, "Hearsay." Catherine was ready. "Your Honor, we're not offering this for the truth of the matter asserted, but to establish the witness's state of mind regarding these property negotiations, which he himself introduced as relevant to the alleged robbery." Judge Whitman was cornered again. Overruled. "The witness will answer." Simmons swallowed hard. Bennett said they always get what they want one way or another. "One way or another," Catherine repeated thoughtfully. "And are you aware that Richard Bennett is married to District Attorney Victoria Reynolds' sister?" The courtroom erupted. Reynolds was on her feet shouting objections as Judge Whitman banged his gavel repeatedly, but the revelation hung in the air like smoke. When order was finally restored, Catherine continued relentlessly. "Mr. Simmons, 2 weeks before the alleged robbery, did you meet with Richard Bennett and Judge Calvin Whitman at the Capital City Club for dinner?" Judge Whitman's gavel crashed down. "Miss Sullivan, this line of questioning is inappropriate and unsupported." Catherine held up a photograph. "Your Honor, Defense Exhibit H shows exactly that meeting obtained from the club's security cameras. Through a subpoena, I moved to introduce this evidence immediately." The courtroom descended into chaos again. Reynolds demanded a recess, which Whitman hastily granted. In the judge's chambers, with the jury excluded Reynolds, and Whitman berated Catherine for ambush tactics, while Kevin sat quietly observing his presence as the legal advisor, now unquestioned, despite his age. "Where did you get these documents?" Reynolds demanded. "You've been investigating sitting officials without proper authority." Catherine remained composed. Every document was legally obtained through public records requests or proper subpoenas. The connection between Piedmont Properties, your brother-in-law's company, and their plan to acquire properties in Oakwood Heights through intimidation is established through these records. She placed a thumb drive on Whitman's desk. This contains emails between Richard Bennett and several city officials discussing how to accelerate property acquisition in Oakwood Heights to make way for a luxury development. Parker Jackson's name appears repeatedly as the primary obstacle due to his community organizing against the project. Judge Whitman's face had turned an alarming shade of purple. This is all circumstantial and irrelevant to the robbery charge. Kevin, who had remained silent, finally spoke. "Your Honor, the emails specifically discuss using legal pressure to remove obstacles. The timing of my grandfather's arrest just 2 days after he organized a community meeting opposing the development isn't circumstantial. It's motive for framing him." Reynolds laughed bitterly. "You're suggesting a vast conspiracy based on business dealings that have nothing to do with this case." "Actually," Catherine interjected, "we have a witness waiting outside. Jacob Kleen, former IT specialist for the city planning department, who will testify that he was instructed to backdate approval documents for the Oakwood Heights project and that he overheard Richard Bennett discussing with Detective Mercer how Jackson needs to be dealt with." The color drained from Reynolds' face. After a tense silence, she made an unexpected move. "I move to dismiss all charges against Parker Jackson in the interest of justice." The sudden reversal was clearly calculated. A dismissal now would prevent the conspiracy evidence from being presented in open court and becoming public record. Judge Whitman seized the opportunity. Motion granted. Case dismissed. Catherine wasn't finished. "Your Honor, we request dismissal with prejudice, and we will be filing a civil rights lawsuit this afternoon, naming several parties present in this room as defendants." When they returned to the courtroom, Judge Whitman announced the dismissal in clipped tones, offering no explanation to the confused spectators and frustrated media. But as Parker embraced his grandson, tears streaming down his weathered face, the story was already leaking. Jacob Kleen had provided copies of his documents to a trusted journalist during the recess, and by evening, the conspiracy would be headline news across the country. Outside the courthouse, surrounded by reporters, Parker stood tall with his arm around Kevin's shoulders. "Justice delayed is not always justice denied," he said, his voice strong with emotion. "Today, because of the courage and brilliance of my grandson, the truth has prevailed." As cameras flashed and questions flew, Kevin spotted men in suits observing from the perimeter, agents from the Georgia Bureau of Investigation and possibly federal authorities. The conspiracy had been exposed, but the full reckoning was just beginning. That night, as they celebrated Parker's freedom at Mrs. Washington's home, their small gathering was interrupted by breaking news. Judge Whitman had recused himself from all pending cases, and D.A. Reynolds had announced an indefinite leave of absence. Detective Mercer had been placed on administrative leave, pending investigation. The system that had nearly crushed them was now on the defensive, and at the center of the storm stood an 8-year-old boy who had accomplished what generations of adults could not, holding power accountable through the very laws designed to protect it. 1 year later, the grand marble steps of the Atlanta County Courthouse presented a very different scene than the tense days of Parker Jackson's trial. The morning sun illuminated a podium where state and federal officials gathered for a press conference that would mark the culmination of the most sweeping anti-corruption investigation in Georgia's modern history. Parker and Kevin DeRuno stood slightly to the side, both dressed in crisp suits, observing the proceedings with quiet dignity. Special Agent Diana Chen of the FBI stepped to the microphone, her expression solemn. "Today we are announcing the indictments of 14 individuals following our year-long investigation into judicial misconduct, evidence tampering, and civil rights violations within the Atlanta criminal justice system." The assembled crowd, largely composed of media and community members from Oakwood Heights, erupted in applause as Agent Chen continued. "These indictments include former Judge Calvin Whitman, former District Attorney Victoria Reynolds, Detective James Mercer, and several executives from Piedmont Properties Group, including Richard Bennett. As cameras flashed and reporters shouted questions, Kevin leaned against his grandfather, both of them taking in the moment with a mixture of satisfaction and lingering disbelief. The investigation had revealed corruption far more extensive than even they had imagined. A systematic effort to use the criminal justice system to target homeowners who refused to sell to developers in historically black neighborhoods throughout Atlanta. Dozens of wrongful convictions were being reviewed, with several already overturned. None of this would have been possible, Agent Chen acknowledged, gesturing toward the Jacksons, without the extraordinary courage and legal acumen of one family who refused to be victimized by a corrupt system. The crowd turned toward Parker and Kevin, breaking into spontaneous applause that echoed across the courthouse plaza. Parker waved modestly, but Kevin stood straight, his young face serious. Despite the celebration, he understood perhaps better than anyone the fragility of the justice they had achieved and how easily it might have gone the other way. The day's proceedings moved inside to courtroom 3B, the same room where their ordeal had begun, now presided over by Judge Amara Wilson, a respected jurist appointed to handle the corruption cases. The courtroom was packed beyond capacity as Judge Wilson called Parker Jackson to the stand, not as a defendant, but as a witness to the systematic abuses that had targeted his community. Mr. Jackson, she began warmly, could you please share with the court how these events have affected you? And your grandson Parker spoke eloquently about the trauma of wrongful arrest, the fear of being separated from Kevin permanently, and the strain placed on their family. But he also spoke of hope. What began as a nightmare has transformed into something powerful. He explained, his deep voice resonating through the hushed courtroom. Our community has united. People who once felt powerless against the system now understand that justice is possible if we stand together and use the law as it was intended to protect all citizens equally. When Parker finished, Judge Wilson made an unprecedented request. The court would like to hear from Kevin DeRuno if he is willing to speak. All eyes turned to the boy, now 9 years old and several inches taller than during the trial. He approached the witness stand with the same composure he had shown throughout the ordeal. After being sworn in, he faced the packed courtroom without a trace of nervousness. Your Honor, he began, his young voice clear and strong. What happened to my grandfather wasn't just about one false arrest or one corrupt judge. It was about a system that expected us to accept injustice because that's what had always happened before. Kevin spoke without notes yet, with the precision and moral clarity that had captivated the nation during the trial. I read in my grandfather's law books that justice is supposed to be blind, that it shouldn't matter what you look like or where you live. But that's not how it worked in practice. People in power decided my grandfather was guilty because it was convenient for them, not because of evidence. He continued, the law is supposed to protect everyone equally, but it can only do that when people understand it and use it correctly. That's why I want to keep studying law, not just to become a lawyer someday, but to help other kids understand their rights now while they're still kids. As Kevin concluded his remarks, many in the courtroom were visibly moved. Judge Wilson herself removed her glasses to wipe away a tear before regaining her judicial composure. Thank you, Kevin. Your courage and intelligence remind us all of why we entered the legal profession in the first place. The proceedings continued with former Judge Thompson taking the stand to explain how he had documented Whitman's pattern of biased rulings for years, creating the foundation for the broader investigation. I watched case after case where justice was denied to people who looked like me, the elderly judge testified. I kept records hoping someday someone would listen. It took the brilliant mind of a child to finally break through the wall of indifference. Catherine Sullivan, who had resigned from her corporate law firm to start a civil rights practice with 2 other attorneys who had left in solidarity, presented evidence of systematic exclusion of black jurors in hundreds of cases presided over by Judge Whitman. Her firm had already secured the reversal of 11 wrongful convictions, with dozens more under review. As the hearing concluded, Judge Wilson made a formal announcement that sent ripples of excitement through the community members present. In recognition of the extraordinary circumstances that brought these injustices to light, the court is establishing the Parker Jackson Legal Education Fund, which will provide resources for young people from underserved communities to learn about their legal rights and pursue careers in law if they choose. She smiled directly at Kevin. The first scholarship has already been designated for when Mr. Kevin DeRuno is ready for law school, although at his current pace he may be teaching at law schools before he's old enough to attend one. The courtroom erupted in laughter and applause. Outside the courthouse, life had changed dramatically for the Jacksons. Parker had been fully exonerated and awarded substantial compensation for his wrongful arrest and detention. He had used part of the settlement to renovate their family home and establish a community center in Oakwood Heights, which now offered legal education workshops for residents. The development project that had triggered the entire ordeal had collapsed when Piedmont Properties investors withdrew following the scandal. Instead, a community land trust had been formed to preserve affordable housing in the neighborhood, with Parker serving on its board. Kevin had returned to school, but not to Oakwood Elementary. Multiple private MEs had offered full scholarships, but he had chosen instead to attend the newly established Justice Academy, a public magnet school focusing on law and civic engagement. There with Ms. Rodriguez now serving as head teacher after leaving her previous position in protest of how Kevin had been treated. He was both student and occasional instructor, helping develop a Know Your Rights curriculum for children. National media had turned Kevin into a reluctant celebrity. He had appeared on magazine covers and been invited to speak at law schools and before congressional committees on judicial reform. Book offers and movie rights had been proposed, but Parker had wisely established a trust to save these opportunities for when Kevin was older and could make his own decisions. Most meaningful to Kevin was the correspondence he received daily from children across the country, many in situations similar to what he had faced, asking for guidance and sharing their own experiences with injustice. With Judge Thompson's help, he responded to as many as possible, providing resources and encouragement. On this momentous day, as the formal proceedings concluded and they prepared to leave the courthouse, a small group waited for them. By the grand entrance, the jurors from Parker's trial reunited for the first time since the case was dramatically dismissed. The elderly black woman who had been the sole person of color on the jury stepped forward, taking Kevin's hands in hers. "We want you to know," she said, her voice trembling with emotion, "that you had convinced us. Even before the case was dismissed, we had already decided to acquit your grandfather. Your presentation of the evidence left no room for reasonable doubt." The other jurors nodded in agreement, several wiping away tears. "We were just waiting for our chance to deliver that verdict." This private vindication, perhaps more than the public celebrations and official acknowledgments, brought a smile to Kevin's serious face. Later that evening, a special ceremony took place on the steps of the state capitol. Governor Michaels, responding to overwhelming public pressure, signed the Jackson Judicial Accountability Act legislation, requiring unprecedented transparency in judicial proceedings and establishing an independent review board for allegations of prosecutorial and judicial misconduct. As Parker and Kevin stood beside the governor for the ceremonial signing cameras, capturing the historic moment, the boy leaned close to his grandfather. "Do you think this will really change things, Grandpa?" he whispered. Parker squeezed his grandson's shoulder. "Change doesn't happen all at once, Kevin. But you've started something important. You've shown people what's possible when someone refuses to accept injustice, even if that someone is just a child." The last rays of sunset illuminated the Capitol dome as Kevin looked out over the gathered crowd. Community members, activists, reporters, and ordinary citizens, drawn together by an extraordinary story of courage and determination. Among them stood Mrs. Washington, Judge Thompson, Catherine Sullivan, and Ms. Rodriguez, the small circle of allies who had believed in them when the entire system stood against them. In that moment, watching the golden light spread across his city, Kevin understood that true justice wasn't just about winning one case or exposing one conspiracy. It was about changing how people thought about what was possible, about giving hope to those who had been taught to expect disappointment, about using knowledge to empower rather than intimidate. As darkness fell and lights began to twinkle across gallant 9-year-old Kevin DeRuno stood tall beside his grandfather, no longer just a child prodigy who had stunned a courtroom, but a symbol of what courage and intelligence could accomplish against seemingly impossible odds. The path ahead remained challenging. True systemic change would require vigilance and continued effort. But on this night, at least, justice had prevailed. What do you think is the most important lesson from Kevin and Parker's extraordinary journey? Has this story changed how you view our justice system? Comment below with your thoughts and share this story with someone who needs inspiration today. If you believe in standing up for what's right, even when the odds seem impossible, hit that like button and subscribe to our channel for more powerful true stories of courage and justice. Remember, as Kevin showed us, you're never too young or too small to make a difference when truth is on your side. Thank you for joining us on this emotional journey, and may we all find the courage to speak truth to power when justice demands it. Kevin and Parker's story teaches us that justice isn't guaranteed. It must be fought for with courage, intelligence, and persistence. In a system often stacked against marginalized communities, knowledge becomes the most powerful weapon. Kevin's extraordinary legal understanding allowed him to navigate a corrupt system that expected compliance, not resistance. His story reminds us that age, race, and social status shouldn't determine one's ability to seek justice. The story also highlights how systemic racism operates not through explicit statements, but through interconnected systems of power. Law enforcement, courts, business interests, and educational institutions working together to maintain inequality. Recognizing these patterns is the first step toward dismantling them. Perhaps most importantly, this story demonstrates the power of community. While many initially retreated in fear, those who stood by the Jacksons, Mrs. Washington, Judge Thompson, Catherine Sullivan, and Ms. Rodriguez provided the support network necessary to challenge entrenched power. True change happens not through lone heroes, but through collective courage. Finally, Kevin's journey shows that laws designed to protect equality can fulfill their purpose when wielded correctly. Understanding legal rights and processes transforms abstract principles into practical tools for justice. The system can work as intended when enough people demand accountability and transparency. What injustice in your community needs to be challenged? Has there been a time when you witnessed discrimination but stayed silent? Share your experiences in the comments below, and let's start a conversation about how we can all be more like Kevin, courageous enough to speak truth to power regardless of our age or circumstances. If this story of a brilliant young boy standing up against corruption and racial injustice inspired you, please hit that like button to help more people discover it. Subscribe to our channel for more powerful stories of everyday heroes fighting for justice and equality. And if you know someone who needs a reminder that one voice can make a difference, share this video with them today.